is the most obvious thing you didn't notice for an extended period of time, thus giving you a "how stupid am I" reaction? Story 1. After looking at dozens of places and much careful consideration, I moved into my beautiful, perfect, beachfront apartment 1 month ago. 2 weeks back, I went to make cookies, no oven. Story 2. When I studied in Mexico, my Spanish skills were pretty rudimentary. The first month I was there, I somehow confused lo siento with yo serios, so when I bumped into someone on the street, instead of saying I'm sorry, I would look at them sincerely and say I'm serious. Once I figured this out, it explained a lot of strange looks. Story 3. I've been living in this house for a year now. There is a button in my bathroom that would fill up the bathtub automatically. I don't even have to turn the taps. I'm still too scared to play with the toilet controls. I think some of them are for ladies, only I pressed the pink button and it washed my. Story 4. This is one I'm particularly ashamed of. Worst of all, it was well before my drug days, so I can't blame it on that, but I got the Sudoku demo cartridge for the original DS and played the game quite frequently, always struggling a bit with each game. Sudoku is a great game. I never needed to buy it because the demo version was giving me hundreds of hours of fun in itself. Of course, the demo was always just the one game over and over. For years I would play it thinking I was getting a new game each time. I don't know what is wrong with me, but I just never noticed. And I struggled with each game as if I were playing it for the first time. I should probably have mentioned this to my doctor. Story 5. In one of my classes in high school, I always used to ask the guy sat next to me for the time. He would always be able to give me the right time, without looking at his watch or phone, even though I couldn't see a clock anywhere in the room. I'd ask him how he always knew the time, and he said that he could tell by the positions of the shadows around the room. After a year of believing this, I noticed there was a clock right there on the wall in front of me. Story 6. There used to be a blind shop near my grandmother's house. We would drive past it, and I always thought of it as an accessory shop for blind people. One day I realized it was a blind shop, as in curtains and blinds. Story 7. Until 3 weeks ago, at the ripe old age of 28, I never knew that Pop-Tarts go in the toaster. Though Pop-Tarts was just a clever name. My parents never did that for us, we just took him to school in all their silvery package glory. I was bored and reading the pantry one day, surprise, there was the toaster instructions. The worst part was when I told my fiancée, who you could imagine's reaction, what the do you think Pop stands for? I then tried it in the toaster. It was a life-changing moment. Story 8. Up until about a month ago, I thought Chick-fil-A was pronounced Chick-fil-A. When someone pronounced it correctly, I literally slapped my forehead, of course, as in filet. Story 9. When I was a teenager, I thought that Visa was forcing people from other countries to get a credit card if they wanted to stay in the US. Guess I wasn't the only one. Story 10. For many years, I didn't get the double meaning from the Sleepy's mattress commercials. Trust Sleepy's, for the rest of your life. Then one day I was driving with my wife, and the commercial came on. I said, why would I want a Sleepy's mattress for the rest of my life? Aren't you supposed to replace them every 10 years or so? She patiently explained the double meaning, and also that I'm an idiot, which is apparently true given the evidence. Story 11. I was in my 30s before I figured out that girls' bicycles have a lower top tube, so they can be ridden more easily and modestly in a dress. I always thought it should be boys' bikes that had the lower tube because nut danger. Story 12. Back when I was in film school, we were in our school's theater watching Back to the Future. Approximately 80 minutes and a girl shouts out in disbelief, "Oh my god, I get it, Back to the Future." Story 13. Not sure if this fits your question exactly, as I was taught a brutal lesson in embarrassment, but, in middle school, I thought was synonymous with pubic hair. One day I mentioned to the guys how I itched my newly acquired pubes. They looked at me with WTF on their faces, so I repeated myself with confidence, yeah. Turns out guys don't have pussies. But until that lesson was learned, I had a. Story 14. I frequently feel like I am forgetting something. On my way to work I always do a complete mental checklist to make sure I'm good to go. You'll be driving and it'll go bra, undies, shirt, pants, socks, shoes, watch. Okay, I'm dressed, my hair is tied back, I have my lunch, my purse, my coat, my ID badge to get past security and into work. Several times I still feel like I'm missing something. On more than one occasion, I've been close to work and gone my keys, and turned around, only to a few minutes later realize, FUCK, I'm an idiot, Jesus Christ, stupid, all my keys are on one key ring, I'm driving my car, thus, I clearly didn't forget my keys. It takes me way longer than it should to realize this every single freaking time it happens. I'm truly an idiot sometimes. I used to work 3 to 11, I would get out of work and go to Denny's and grab dinner because it was the only place open in Nashua, New Hampshire, where I lived at the time. Is there another reason to go to Denny's anyway? You should know that Nashua is a medium-sized city of 80,000 directly on the Mass border, not rural NH, so I get out of my car and start walking to the door when I notice everyone looking directly at me from the restaurant. Everyone, even the cooks. I check my zipper and it's not open. I look around and nothing, odd, I keep walking to the door, they start pointing vigorously. I look at my zipper again, then around. Nothing. Someone opens the door enough to stick their head out and yells, "For God's sake, get I in here." I look around and point at myself to say me. I speed up to the door and then reflected in the glass I see the huge bull moose 10 feet behind me. Once safely inside I see it had damaged 3 cars and was frothy at the mouth. Not rabies we found out later, just confused and pissed. The good news was none of the 4 other cars he damaged after I got there and before the police showed up and tranked him, was mine. Edit this happened in 1988. It was a long time ago. I choose a number of damaged cars that sounded right from memory. It could have been fewer. And they weren't totaled, just scratched and dented a bit, and one had a broken window. Story 15. Not me, but one couple had been fighting over something stupid for nearly 20 years. My mom and dad were looking at a house for sale. They were being shown around inside by the man and woman who currently lived there. While being shown the dining room, the woman showed my mother the nice sliding doors that hid inside the wall. My mother, wanting to see if the door's rails still worked properly, opened the doors the full way so the door was completely hidden inside the wall. The woman jumps forward saying, "Oh no, you've pushed them too far. This always happens to us with new people. The doors are too far in the wall, and it takes us forever to pry us out because we can't reach it." My mother looks at her quite shocked, as my then family home had the same style of door and grabbed the hidden handle, the type where you push the top of the handle and a little hook pops out the bottom of the handle. Edit this thing on the door, and easily pulled the door out. The woman and her husband stood there in shock and later explained that they used to get in fights over this door for years. My parents laughed and left. They never bought the house. TLDR, couple fights for years over broken door, only to realize there was a handle the whole time. Story 16. Got lost driving upstate New York by myself once. At 1 a.m., took a wrong turn trying to get to Route 17, and wound up in a little town that clearly wasn't where I wanted to be. It was a bit foggy and my phone Evio was constantly rebooting and I didn't have a GPS. Nothing was open, streets completely vacant, no signs of life at all. It was a bit creepy. It got creepier when, as I was driving around trying to find a way back to the highway, I noticed that there were tuxedo shops everywhere. It seemed like every other shop was a tuxedo shop. Why would a town need so many tuxedo shops? It got to the point where I was in a near panic state. I started driving faster through this little town, counting tuxedo shops. I stopped counting at 15 and concluded I was the protagonist in a Twilight Zone episode. Panic set in. I drove anywhere where there isn't a tuxedo shop, turn around and just keep going, don't stop. Finally I see the highway. I drive the wrong way up the ramp, cross over the median and get the out of there. Traffic rules be damned, I was going to be trapped in some odd little town seemingly in the middle of nowhere that consisted of tuxedo shops. I was picturing every person coming out wearing tuxedos trying to get me to stay forever. I finally escaped and got to my destination. I didn't tell a soul about it for about a year. One day my wife and I are driving the same route and I tell her about the strange little town where all the shops were tuxedo shops. Turns out I was in Tuxedo, New York, FML. Story 17. Doing everything a girl asks will never give you any. Edit. I need to quote Milhouse for those of you who didn't understand. When she sees you'll do anything she says, she's bound to respect you. When I was young I was a Milhouse in that way, that I did whatever girls asked of me and thought they would fall in love with me in time. They didn't. So now as an adult, that is not a strategy one employ nor promote. Story 18. When you told my brother when he was about 8 or younger years old that you had hidden something and he had to find it, he would always look in the most difficult spots to hide objects. I always placed the toy or whatever on the counter or table, out in the open, and it took him forever to notice the obvious. He's not stupid, he's just always making things difficult. Story 19. I used to play Pokemon Red as a little boy. I couldn't read English since my native language is Dutch, therefore I skipped tutorial and didn't know I could catch the Pokemon. I played it for over 2 years with just one Pokemon till a friend told me I could use a Pokeball to catch them. Story 20. That band-aids are supposed to resemble the color of skin so they blend in. I was probably 22 or so before I made that realization. Even as a white person, I never realized they were tan-beige to match skin tone. I just thought it was a random color they chose for that particular product. Story 21. Okay, so once or twice a month we order takeout from a burger shop near our house. Every time I call up and make an order, at the end of the conversation, whoever I'm talking to usually says something along the lines of, "Okay, that'll be 15 minutes and it's 42. The number at the end changes every time, and I assumed they were telling me how much it was. I do the math on my way there, get confused because it was always wrong. One day, after about 6 months of this happening, and having ordered a fair bit of food, the young boy said, "Okay thanks, that's 116. I thought, they can't be serious, we didn't order that much. Went down and it was about $50. I asked why they always quote the wrong price, and the lady said loudly, "Oh darling, that's not the price, that's your ticket number," prompting laughs from everyone in the store. Though, I think I'd rather pay the 116. Story 22. IHOP International House of Pancakes. I actually thought they were 2 different chains. Why are we pulling into the IHOP parking lot? I thought we were going to the International my god. I was all excited too, cause I thought I'd never been to an International House of Pancakes before. Story 23. For a long period of time, I thought that the famous Beatles song started "Hey Jude." It always struck me as very odd and I couldn't, no matter how hard I tried, see how it fit in with the rest of the song. However, for some weird reason I never checked out the lyrics. Across the universe was a huge "oh, now I get it" moment for me. Story 24. I have more than once driven into my apartment's parking lot and thought, "Oh, my car is gone." I got towed again before realizing I'm driving my car. Story 25. So there are these 2 girls. They sit opposite me at lunch. I'd say perhaps an hour of time a day. These girls are sat directly in front of me. 5 hours a week, 20 odd weeks before I'd noticed. So 100 hours of being next to these 2 girls. Shit, you 2 are identical twins. Story 26. The hunter in Jumanji is his father. Edit. Yes, as some have pointed out, it is a representation of his conflicts with his father in childhood. Edit 2 spoiler. Although I think if you haven't seen it by now, you don't really want to see it that badly. Story 27. I had no idea that How I Met Your Mother was the story about Ted. I thought he was telling the story about Lily and Marshall. When I realized it, I haven't felt that dumb in a while. Story 28. I'm 31 and have never been a very strong swimmer. I can stay afloat, but getting from point A to point B is cumbersome. A few weeks ago I was in the pool, and I realized that although I cup my hands slightly when I swim, flippers aren't like that at all. They're flat blades, so I straightened out my hands and now they're actually useful. They knife through the water and behave much more like I would expect necessary to swim well. Story 29. Q. What gets wetter the more it dries? A towel. I didn't really get this riddle for years. In my mind, one uses a towel to dry themselves. A towel doesn't dry you. So, for a long time, I was imagining that the riddle was that a towel that is left to dry doesn't really dry. You leave it to dry, but the high humidity in the bathroom after you take a hot shower prevents the towel from drying, and in fact, it will absorb ambient moisture in the air as it condenses. I blame poor ambiguous wording for my confusion, but it wouldn't be much of a riddle if it were worded what gets wetter the more it is used to dry something else. Story 30. Arby's is pronounced RBS and they serve roast beef. Me and my friends at work all just made this connection. Edit looks like our revelation was merely coincidence. RB actually stands for Raffle Brothers, the founders of the restaurant Source. Story 31. For years I thought the word several meant seven. For some reason I thought it went couple two, few three, several seven. I thought this until the age of 15 when I was opening a microwave meal and asked, why do I have to pierce the film lid 7 times? I'm sure it works equally well 5, 6 or 8 times. I wonder sometimes how I remember to breathe. Story 32. I thought grilled cheese sandwiches were grouchy sandwiches because I had called them that my entire childhood until I was like 16 and no one corrected me. Story 33. Never realized there was a white 2 on the front of my house until last year. I've been living there since I was born, 18 years strong. When I said it, my dad just shook his head in disbelief. Story 34. Non-English speaker here. 1. K9 is pronounced K9. I always thought it was an internal code for the dog unit, and that other units had similar codes like K8 and K10 too. That the, oh god here it comes, Reagan spell that slowly but steadily fills your health bar in Final Fantasy VII is the first 5 letters in regeneration and not just some obscure made-up name. 3. The name 0 punctuation most likely refers to the way he speaks. When looking back at things I am not always a very smart person. Story 35. I think I was in my 30s before I made the connection that cracker was a throwback to slavery days of the whip cracker. I had always thought it was because crackers as in saltines were creamy white, like me. Story 36. My oldest sister had twins. The middle sister, also older than me, was standing in the kitchen when she said to the oldest, I knew you were having 2 babies but I didn't know they were twins. Possibly the worst moment of my mother's life. Story 37. It took me about 7 years to realize that the date September 11th is the same as the emergency services number. Also, I was probably around 16 when I finally realized the double meaning of the phrase it's always in the last place you look. Story 38. Once I received a dollar bill with a deer's head on it instead of a president's face as a gift. 2 years later I was lucky enough to have a son. After he reached the age of 5 I came across the bill again and gave it to him as part of his gift for his birthday. He looked at it for about 3 seconds and said, it's a sticker, and peeled the deer head off of a normal dollar bill. The deer head dollar was a lie for all of those years. Story 39. The Super Bowl isn't on Thanksgiving. It's in February. I thought there were multiple Super Bowls per year until last year when I was talking to my husband about it. Story 40. What John Aaron meant when he said the seed is strong. After watching the TV series, reading book 1 to 4, it hit me what it meant while rewatching the show before starting A Dance with Dragons. Story 41. For the longest time I just assumed that buzzing cicadas was just the sound that hot sun makes. Then one day I was like the sun doesn't make sounds. Story 42. That my aunt's friend whom she was always with was in fact not her friend, but her wife. They were together before I was born. Took me until about 13 to put 2 and 2 together. Story 43. Incinerator garbage disposals. WTF is an aerator, incinerator, word magic. When peeing with morning, you can just step back a bit. You cover the longer distance and still hit the water. I've been all over my toilet every morning for years before I realized this. Though caution is advised, sometimes you feel you're losing your as you're peeing. This is where you need to adjust. Start by doing little steps forward. Go from there depending on how fast you're losing it. Story 44. I did not know how iced coffee worked. My wife got it all the time but I never had any or got it for her. Just a month ago she asked me to get her some in at Turkey Hill local gas station. I walked in and put some ice cubes into the cup and then proceeded to fill it with hot coffee. I stared at the cup and was like WDF. I figured I was doing something wrong but could not figure out what. I ended up going out to the car and asked my wife to assist. It was a shameful Saturday morning and she brings it up often. TLDR, had no clue how iced coffee worked. Story 45. I'm 26 years old and probably 1 year ago I was told that cobwebs were made by spiders. I had no clue. I felt like the dumbest person alive. I just assumed it was how certain dust formed. Now it makes sense of course when you look at it and see it, it's just spiders' webs with dust on it. Story 46. When I was an exchange student in Germany, I was helping my host brother work on his motorcycle. He asked me to hand him a screwdriver, and I said what kind. He said plus, It hit me at that moment that what I'd known as Phillips head and flat head my whole life made way more sense as simply plus and minus. Story 47. I was an avid reader of the Hardy Boys as a young man. I read the line "I've been misled" in one of the books for years. I pronounced that as Missy LD. I thought getting Missy LD was like getting shot down by a missile or something. Eventually I figured out how it was pronounced. Gave my wife a good laugh when I told her that story though. Story 48. That the sketchy building just down the street from the house I grew up in is a strip club. That isn't remarkable, I know, but I had driven by and stared at that building countless times without ever thinking about why the billboard had a naked chick on it and said dancers nightly. It hit me one day like a ton of bricks how stupid I must be to miss that. Then one day last year I was driving by with my cousin, and we saw a woman outside in a short skirt with a purple wig. Much laughing ensued. Have not been there myself. Story 49. When the characters on that 70s show are sitting around the table with a spinning camera shot. They're actually smoking weed. Had no idea until a couple weeks ago. And I don't smoke, so there's no excuse. Story 50. About 6 months ago, I realized the moon is not in fact partially covered up when only part of it is lit up, but it is being hit with light from another angle rather. I mean my eyesight could be better, but still, felt like an idiot. Story 51. I'm a pianist who has been playing for 18 years. I teach private lessons, and a few weeks ago I was teaching my 8-year-old student to play chopsticks for fun and she observed, "Oh, it's called chopsticks because you play with 2 fingers like they're chopsticks." My head fell off. Story 52. Accents, such as in French, actually change the accent you put on letters and syllables. French is my first language. I always thought they were for extra sounds, but not to change the emphasis put on an actual letter. Story 53. When I first got my PlayStation 3, I had no idea the controllers were wireless. I kept thinking, why did they make the cord so short? I was scrounging USB extenders from work so I didn't have to sit so close to the TV. Eventually I did something and the controller unplugged and continued to work. I felt like a giant. Story 54. For months, I sat backwards every time I used this one machine at Planet Shitness. The one where you put the pin in the weight stack and then pull down on the handle overhead, like pull-ups for wimps. I just discovered I've been doing it backwards all this time. I had even thought before, why would they have this so that you have to look at the wall while using it? I am not a smart man apparently. Story 55. The bands Third Eye Blind and Finger 11 are references to a penis. For all intents and purposes isn't for all intensive purposes. After a show segment, they'd say show name is brought to you by. For the longest time, I thought it was some fancy word I hadn't learned yet. Brock to Bay. Story 56. Watermelon. Last summer I was eating watermelon and thought to myself, this watermelon is so juicy it's almost like I'm biting into water. I've loved watermelon all my life and just never really thought about it, I guess. Story 57. I don't know how obvious stupid this is, but I recently realized in medical school that the term funny bone is a play on words, referring to your humerus bone, which is a homophone of the word humerus. Technically, you could argue that when people bump their funny bone, it's actually a very minor ulnar nerve neuropathy involving compression of the nerve by the medial epicondyle of the humerus. But where's the fun in that? Story 58. For the longest time, until I was about 17, even after being a huge music lover, though Elton John was part of the Beatles. If I know why, the ants are my friends. They're blowing in the wind, the ants, they are blowing in the wind. Story 59. Just got on Reddit recently. Now I see that everything my friends post on Facebook that I think is clever, funny or interesting is they have stolen from here. Makes me feel better about myself and the stuff I post. Story 60. Defeces. Get rid of feces. Toddlers are called that because they toddle. Whenever I think of small children now I picture small drunk humans, toddling about. Story 61. I didn't realize that AKA meant also known as. I knew they meant the same thing, but didn't spot the obvious acronym until I was explaining AKA is very similar to also known as to a child. Story 62. Not me, but my dad. He didn't know that ambulance was written backwards on ambulances to read in your mirror, until he was about 45. He's almost 60 now and we still give him a hard time about that one. Story 63. Our blood never actually turns blue. Textbooks and diagrams just commonly use blue to denote deoxygenated blood so you can tell the difference. Imagine being 33 and trying to explain the concept of why we have a heart to your 4-year-old, then having your wife say, wait, stop. Did you just tell our kid humans have blue blood? Have you ever gotten a cut in your life? Story 64. The words peace and peace. In school they would say that when you meant there was no conflict, you meant to spell it as PAC, but then they would say, to spell peace as in a piece of pie, you spell it PIC. I just realized they use the example piece of pie because the word pie is already in the word peace, thus helping you to not get the letters I and E switched around incorrectly. Spelling pace. I just realized this at age 30. Story 65. Not me, but I had to explain to my 30-year-old coworkers that pickles are just cucumbers soaked in vinegar or brine. I also had to explain to one of them that mayonnaise and Miracle Whip are not the same thing. Story 66. My friend and I were trying to find a place to have lunch. We didn't want to go far from campus since we had class soon. My friend then said, hey, let's try this place. Plus it's 20 off for seniors. To which I replied, those are for people over 60. Story 67. I used to always pronounce the department store Beal's name like Bellis. Last week, my friend looked at me funny, pointed at the bell in the A of the name, and said, it's pronounced bells, don't you see the bell? Story 68. Growing up, my father created two characters. Louis using his left thumb, pointer and middle finger, and Ralph same digits, right hand. They would interact in odd ways, get in fights, and often tickle us for most of my childhood. Okay, until I was 18, I had no idea how to remember which one was Louis and which one was Ralph. Even just typing this, I feel like a failure. Story 69. I thought Will Smith was from Westville, Winovia, born and raised. I guess I assumed Winovia was a state and Westville was a town there. He actually says West Philadelphia. Story 70. The reason there's always hay matted into horse is because horses eat the hay and don't digest it, not that there's someone covering it up with hay. I always wondered whose job it was to sprinkle the hay on horse when I went for walks on trails. I can't believe it took me so long to piece it together. Story 71. Sara Lee Bakery dessert slogan. Nobody doesn't like Sara Lee. All these years I thought they were saying nobody does it like Sara Lee. Personally, I think my way makes more sense. No double negatives. Story 72. For me it was the movie 500 Days of Summer. I thought that the title had to do with some deeper meaning about him being in a state of perpetual summer, or at least 500 days, summer being the best time of year, etc., etc. Only after having watched it for the third time did I realize it just had to actually do with Zooey Deschanel and the 500 days he was hung up on her. Oh, did I feel dumb. Story 73. I had a teacher that had only 2 fingers and a thumb on one of his hands in high school, and I didn't notice until I heard some of the other kids talking about it about a month into the semester, despite the fact that the teacher constantly gesticulated with that hand. Also, in college I worked part-time at a coffee shop and had the same thing happen again. One of my coworkers only had 3 fingers and a thumb. I never noticed. About a year after I had stopped working there, one of my friends who had also worked there mentioned it in conversation. I thought he was pulling my leg, so I called 2 other ex-coworkers to verify. Apparently I don't look at people's hands. Story 74. I sat in my friend's living room for about 3 hours yesterday before noticing the giant pink halberd in the corner of the room. When it comes to giant pink halberds, 3 hours feels like a long time. Story 75. I eat every day at the same diner. Forgot one of the waitresses' name after a while, couldn't remember and was too embarrassed to ask her, as we talk all the time and she knows me by name. For a year I wondered, eating there every day, then I saw her name tag. Story 76. The literal meaning of the word news. When used in newspaper or watch the evening news, I was in my late 20s before I grasped that it meant the things that are new today, just never thought about it before. Story 77. For years, my dad would pick up his slippers and look at the bottoms. Seeing an L, he would place the first on his left foot and the remaining one on his right. He would think to himself, wow, I always pick up the left one first. Weird. One day, he realized L stood for large. Story 78. I noticed that your teens end when you turn 20. I thought they ended at 18 when you were legally considered an adult. I didn't know it referred to number ages that end in teen. Story 79. I wore this t-shirt for 2 years without making the connection. I just thought it was a t-shirt in favor of peas. Story 80. While my wife and I were engaged, I looked at her one day and said, "You're writing with your left hand." 9 months together, and I had no idea she was left-handed. Story 81. Oh yeah, like in The Sixth Sense you find out that dude in the hairpiece the whole time, that's Bruce Willis, the whole movie. Story 82. A few years back, I was invited to a friend's birthday celebration at a club which I had never been to before. As a very socially oblivious and proudly punctual person, I showed up at the time announced on Facebook. Consequently, I arrived a good 45 minutes before the birthday girl or any of her other friends, for whom casual lateness was a social norm. This gave me plenty of time to wander the club and look around. After the first 10 minutes, I began to notice the number of videos projected on the wall. The videos featured scantily clad men posing in various provocative positions. What an edgy place, this must be what clubs in New York are like. 25 minutes in, I was wandering in circles inside the large club, hoping to bump into anyone else who was also there for my friend's birthday. At the very least, by moving continuously, I could avoid standing around and being mistakenly judged as a weird loner at the club all on his own. It was at this time that I noticed the waiters' outfits. The cocktail servers who had begun to navigate their way through the tables were wearing nothing but the skimpiest of Speedos. The 3 or 4 I could see at the time were all men. Their attire caused my younger, unexposed self to feel slightly uncomfortable. I immediately, however, realized that if the waiters were so provocatively dressed, then surely the waitress's clothing must be absolutely fantastic. I made up my mind to order a drink from a surprisingly exotic selection of fruity and colorful cocktails from the first scantily clad cocktail waitress I might happen to see. I'll admit I had my crude motivations, but by that time I had been waiting for half an hour and I was most excited about simply breaking the monotony of the wait. 5 more minutes passed. I had not spotted any waitresses, but the number of waiters in Speedos had grown. Perhaps it's ladies' night. That would explain why the birthday girl is having her party here, I speculated. I then concluded that putting waiters in Speedos and projecting near-pornographic videos on walls must be a bad gimmick for attracting female clientele. If anything, there were less women per man than any of the few bars I had ever been to. Just then, I finally received confirmation from my friends that they were on their way. Relieved that company was finally on the way, I headed to the men's room, confident that my friends would arrive by the time I was done. On my way, I pondered how I could master casual lateness, but my train of thought was derailed the moment I entered the men's room. Phew, was at the rowdiest restroom I had ever seen. It almost seemed like there was more of a party in the men's room than on the dance floor. I mentally noted not to get as drunk as the rambunctious patrons in the other stalls, ignored the odd holes between the stalls and the cacophony from around the room and got out quickly. Back on the floor, after navigating between 3 different pairs of same couples making out, I finally ran into a friend and fellow guest of the birthday girl. "Man, this a wild club. I've never been any place like this before," I yelled over the thumping music. "Yeah, who knew gay clubs could be so fun?" he yelled back. My jaw dropped to the ground. I had spent almost an hour in my first gay club without a clue. Ended up being a great night. I got over the last of the lingering homophobia from my adolescence, got to order the most delicious fruity cocktails I ever had, and began to finally get the hang of being casually late. Note hopefully extended period of time is weighted by how obvious the overlooked thing is. 45 minutes seemed like a long time, until I started reading the other comments. TLDR, I was in a gay club for almost an hour before I noticed anything was different. Story 83. There's a stupid children joke in Spanish, phrased in a question and answer format. Por qué el gato es el único animal que es dos animals? Por qué es gato y era this? To me, was like, why are cats the only animals that are 2 animals at the same time? Because they are cats and spiders, and I thought they called them spiders because they were nimble. It's more than 20 years since I heard this joke for the first time, and it was this year that I finally understood it. They weren't saying spider, but scratch. Yeah, the same word has 2 meanings. On my defense, I have to say my primary language is Catalan, but I felt really stupid. Story 84. I grew up and/or lived in areas that didn't have a grid. Michigan, Hawaii. After I moved to Chicago, I had lived there for a year before I figured out that the street addresses corresponded to the numbered streets. 6201 was between 62nd and 63rd Street. For example, totally blew my mind. I just thought my coworkers knew the city really, really well.